The autumn of 1944 was a time of immense hope and crushing logistical reality for the Allied armies in Western Europe. After the D-Day landings and the spectacular breakout from Normandy, Allied forces surged across France and Belgium with breathtaking speed, liberating city after city, pushing the Wehrmacht into a desperate, headlong retreat. The euphoria of victory was palpable, and many believed the war would be over by Christmas. Yet, behind this dazzling facade of triumph, a colossal and increasingly urgent problem threatened to bring the entire offensive to a grinding halt. This was the paradox of victory. The faster the Allied armies advanced, the more desperately they struggled to supply themselves. The lightning pace of the advance meant that frontline units were quickly outrunning their logistical tail, stretching supply lines hundreds of miles back to the original Normandy beachheads. Despite the ingenuity of the Red Ball Express and the Pluto pipelines, the sheer volume of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment required by millions of men and thousands of vehicles was simply overwhelming the existing infrastructure. Critical shortages began to appear at the front, forcing dangerous pauses in the advance. Hitler and his high command, though reeling from the devastation of their forces in France, seized upon this logistical vulnerability as their last, best hope. They understood that the Allied armies were utterly dependent on massive, continuous supply. Without the ability to offload hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo daily, the Allied war machine would inevitably stall. And to offload such tonnage, the Allies needed deep water ports. The most vital, the most indispensable, and the largest port in Western Europe was Antwerp, in Belgium. Antwerp, with its sprawling docks, extensive rail network, and sheltered inland location, had been captured almost intact by the British 11th Armoured Division on September 4, 1944. Its seizure was a tactical miracle, a gift to the exhausted Allied logistics. However, capturing the city was one thing, using the port was another entirely. To make Antwerp fully operational, the Allies needed to control the Scheldt Estuary, a 65-mile-long, heavily fortified waterway that connected Antwerp to the North Sea. Without controlling the estuary, no supply ship could reach the port. This was where Hitler placed his desperate gamble. He issued unequivocal orders. The German forces guarding the Scheldt Estuary were to hold at all costs. Their mission was to deny the Allies the use of Antwerp, thereby starving their advance, buying precious time for German regrouping, and allowing for a decisive counterattack. What followed was a brutal, grinding campaign, a hellish, month-long battle fought through some of the most miserable terrain in Western Europe. This was the Battle of the Scheldt, an often overlooked crucible where Canadian, British, and Polish forces would fight tooth and nail against fanatical German resistance. It was a battle for mud, water, and sand dunes, a grim amphibious struggle for control of every inch of the estuary's islands and shorelines. It was the crucial, bloody, and desperate fight for the port that, in the end, truly broke Germany's will, ensuring the indispensable lifeline for the final push into Germany, and ultimately sealing the Third Reich's fate. The paradox of victory would only be resolved by entering the hell of the Scheldt. The port of Antwerp, Belgium, was not merely a port, it was the indispensable port for the Allied war effort in Western Europe. Its strategic importance was so immense that its capture and full operational status became an absolute imperative, a logistical bottleneck that had to be broken at any cost. Without Antwerp, the entire momentum of the Allied advance, so rapidly gained after the breakout from Normandy, was doomed to a slow, agonizing halt. The city of Antwerp itself, a bustling urban center and historically one of Europe's largest ports, was a sprawling complex of docks, piers, warehouses, and an extensive rail network. Unlike the battered and demolished ports of Normandy, it was captured almost miraculously intact by the British 11th Armoured Division on September 4, 1944. This was an unlooked-for gift, a logistical jackpot that offered the potential to solve the Allied supply crisis overnight. However, the geographical reality of Antwerp presented a critical challenge. While the city and its docks were captured, the port lay some 65 miles, 105 kilometers, inland from the North Sea, connected by the meandering and heavily fortified Scheldt Estuary. This vital waterway was effectively a German stronghold. As long as German forces controlled the shores of the estuary, no Allied supply ship could safely navigate the channel to reach Antwerp's docks. A captured port without an open access route was, strategically, no port at all. The sheer capacity of Antwerp was unrivaled in Western Europe. Its docks could handle hundreds of large cargo ships simultaneously, offloading millions of tons of supplies per month. This was exponentially greater than the combined capacity of all the Normandy beachheads and the Mulberry Bey artificial harbor. To understand its necessity, massive tonnage, the Allied armies required approximately 25,000 to 30,000 tons of supplies per day to sustain their operations. Normandy's facilities could barely manage a fraction of this, and the Red Ball Express, though heroic, was a stopgap measure designed for speed, not sustainable bulk. Antwerp could handle the sheer scale of this demand. Direct rail and road links. Antwerp boasted excellent rail and road connections directly into Belgium and eventually into the Netherlands and Germany. This would drastically shorten the logistical tail, reducing reliance on vulnerable truck convoys and freeing up manpower and vehicles. Relief for exhausted lines. The continuous strain on the Red Ball Express and other improvised supply routes was immense. Opening Antwerp would provide much-needed relief, allowing for more efficient and resilient logistical planning for the final push into Germany. For Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his logistical chiefs, the equation was stark: no Antwerp, no sustained advance. Without the port's capacity, the armies would be forced to halt, regroup, and consolidate, giving the Germans precisely the breathing room they desperately needed. Every mile the armies advanced further inland from Normandy without a major port simply exacerbated the supply crisis. The fuel, ammunition, and food were running dangerously low at the front, and the long, arduous truck journeys from Normandy were proving unsustainable in the long term. Hitler, despite his recent battlefield setbacks, recognized this strategic vulnerability with chilling clarity. He issued unyielding orders. The German forces holding the Scheldt Estuary were to fight to the last man. Their mission was to deny the Allies the use of Antwerp for as long as possible. He knew that if Antwerp remained closed, the Allied advance would eventually wither, giving him time to prepare his defenses, consolidate his forces, and perhaps even launch a counteroffensive. Thus, the struggle for the Scheldt Estuary was not a sideshow, it was the next truly decisive battle for Western Europe. The capture of Antwerp city was a critical first step, but opening the waterway was the ultimate prize. The Allied armies, after their spectacular dash across France, were about to run into a formidable, well-prepared, and fanatically defended obstacle, the natural gateway to their indispensable lifeline. The stage was set for a brutal, grinding campaign that would be fought for every agonizing mile of the muddy, waterlogged estuary. For Adolf Hitler, the battle for the Scheldt Estuary was not just another defensive action, it was a desperate, make-or-break gamble. Having been decisively routed across France, denying the Allies the use of Antwerp became his last, best hope for stabilizing the Western Front, buying precious time, and perhaps even turning the tide of the war. He issued fanatical orders: the Scheldt must be held at all costs, for if the Allies were starved of supply, their advance would halt, and the Wehrmacht could regroup and strike back. The German strategy for holding the Scheldt was both shrewd and ruthless, designed to maximize the natural defensive advantages of the estuary's unique geography. The Scheldt Estuary itself is a complex network of islands, mudflats, and deeply indented shorelines, making it a natural fortress. German engineers and military planners understood this terrain perfectly, and over years, had transformed it into a formidable part of the Atlantic Wall defenses. The core of their defense rested on three main components. The South Beveland Peninsula. This long, narrow peninsula on the northern bank of the estuary, leading directly to the port of Antwerp, was heavily fortified. It was crisscrossed with drainage ditches, canals, and dikes, which the Germans could selectively breach to flood vast areas, turning the landscape into a treacherous, muddy quagmire impassable for vehicles and incredibly difficult for infantry. This wet defense was a formidable obstacle in itself. Walcheren Island, the fortress island, located at the mouth of the estuary, Walcheren Island was the linchpin of the entire German defense. It was a natural bastion, heavily fortified with concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, many capable of covering the entire estuary with their fire, anti-tank ditches, and intricate minefields. Its coastal guns, part of the Atlantic Wall, were designed to sink any ship attempting to enter the channel. The island was ringed with heavily armed strongpoints, manned by experienced and fanatical German troops, including elements of the 64th Infantry Division and paratroopers. Breskens Pocket, south bank. On the southern bank of the estuary lay the Breskens Pocket, a heavily defended area running from Zeebrugge to the Leopold Canal. This region, a complex maze of canals, dikes, and fortified positions, was manned by the remnants of the German 15th Army. These were not demoralized, retreating troops. They were battle-hardened veterans, many of whom had been isolated and forced to fight their way out of the Falaise Pocket, and were now grimly determined to hold their ground. Their objective was simple: deny access to the estuary, preventing any Allied shipping from reaching Antwerp. The terrain itself was a formidable ally for the Germans. The flooded polders, the vast mudflats exposed at low tide, the intricate network of canals, and the often miserable autumn weather of the Low Countries created a nightmarish battleground for any attacking force. Visibility was often poor, movement was painfully slow, and every advance across open ground became a brutal test of endurance against dug-in defenders. Hitler's orders were clear: the Scheldt must be held to the last man. No withdrawal was to be permitted. This fanatical resolve, combined with the natural strength of the terrain and years of defensive preparations, meant that the Allied armies were not facing a disorganized, retreating enemy. Instead, they were about to crash headlong into a meticulously planned, ruthlessly executed, and fiercely defended series of obstacles. The battle for the Scheldt was designed by the Germans to be a grinding, bloody, and protracted fight, a hellscape that would cost the Allies dearly and, they hoped, fatally cripple their march to victory. With the strategic imperative of opening Antwerp clear, Allied command turned its attention to the formidable task of breaching Hitler's Scheldt defenses. The mission was assigned primarily to the 1st Canadian Army, a diverse formation under the command of General Guy Simonds. This army, comprising Canadian, British, and Polish divisions, was poised to undertake one of the most grueling and complex amphibious operations of the entire war. The decision to commit these forces to such a brutal, grinding battle underscored the absolute necessity of Antwerp. The 1st Canadian Army was a well-trained and battle-hardened formation, but nothing could fully prepare them for the hellish terrain and fanatical resistance they were about to face. Key units included the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, tasked with the initial advance north towards the South Beveland Peninsula and the push towards Walcheren. These were tough, experienced infantrymen, but they were about to confront a landscape designed to deny mechanized warfare. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, spearheading the attacks on the Breskens Pocket on the southern bank, these troops would become experts in amphibious assaults across treacherous waterways and fortified polders. They would face some of the most determined German resistance. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division, while armoured units were crucial for rapid advances, their role in the waterlogged Scheldt terrain would prove challenging, often requiring adaptation to more infantry-centric tactics. The British 52nd Lowland Infantry Division, a specialized mountain warfare division, surprisingly adapted for amphibious assault. Their expertise in combined operations, including river crossings and assault landings, would be vital, particularly in the later stages of the battle for Walcheren Island. The Polish 1st Armored Division, under the command of General Stanislaw Maczek, these highly motivated and battle-tested Poles, having fought valiantly through France, would contribute significantly to the eastern flanks of the advance, though the bulk of the Scheldt fighting was reserved for the Canadian forces. General Guy Simonds, a highly capable and innovative commander, was tasked with orchestrating this complex operation. He understood the terrain, the strength of the German defenses, and the morale of the enemy. He knew this would not be a lightning strike but a grinding, attritional battle where every mile gained would be paid for in blood. His strategy called for a series of coordinated, often amphibious, assaults to systematically clear both banks of the estuary and, finally, to assault the fortress island of Walcheren. The Allied forces faced monumental challenges even before engaging the enemy. The low-lying terrain of the Scheldt Estuary meant that engineers were constantly battling water. The Germans had deliberately flooded vast areas, turning agricultural land into shallow, muddy lakes that were too deep for infantry to wade easily and too shallow for conventional boats. Roads and dikes became the only viable routes, turning every advance into a linear, exposed grind against prepared positions. The miserable autumn weather, with its persistent rain, fog, and chilling winds, only compounded the misery, exacerbating the suffering of the troops and hindering air support. Despite these daunting prospects, the Canadian-led forces, bolstered by their British and Polish comrades, embarked on their mission with grim determination. They understood the strategic imperative. They knew that behind the mud and the machine guns, the ultimate prize was Antwerp, the lifeline that would sustain the Allied armies and deliver the fatal blow to Germany. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and strategically vital, yet often overlooked, campaigns of World War II, a testament to Allied resolve against a desperate, fanatical defense. The 1st Canadian Army was about to march into the hell of the Scheldt. The Battle of the Scheldt was not a single, continuous engagement, but a series of brutal, interconnected struggles, each demanding distinct tactics and immense sacrifice. The first major phase, launched on October 6, 1944, focused on clearing the southern bank of the Scheldt Estuary, an area dubbed the Breskens pocket. This was a heavily fortified German stronghold, running from the Leopold Canal to the sea, designed to prevent any Allied shipping from daring to approach Antwerp. For the attacking Allied forces, primarily the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, it proved to be a hellish, grinding amphibious struggle against a determined and fanatical enemy. The terrain of the Breskens pocket was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. It was a flat, low-lying landscape, crisscrossed by countless drainage ditches, canals, and dikes. The Germans had ingeniously and cruelly breached many of these dikes, deliberately flooding vast areas. This transformed the polders, reclaimed land, into a treacherous, watery maze, too deep for infantry to wade easily, too shallow for most boats, and utterly impassable for tanks and heavy vehicles. The few dry roads and dikes became elevated causeways, turning every Allied advance into a linear, exposed crawl, directly into the concentrated fire of dug-in German positions. The German defenders were the remnants of the 15th Army, under the command of General Gustav Adolf von Zongen. Crucially, these were not the shattered, demoralized troops that had fled across France. Many were hardened veterans who had fought their way out of the Falaise pocket, augmented by naval infantry and even paratroopers. They were grimly determined, well entrenched, and fully understood the strategic importance of their position. Their orders were simple: hold at all costs, deny the Allies Antwerp. The Canadians launched their assault with a frontal attack across the Leopold Canal, a formidable water barrier that formed the eastern boundary of the pocket. This was a brutal and costly amphibious operation. Specially adapted Buffalo amphibious vehicles, LVT-4s, originally designed for landing troops on beaches, were pressed into service, slogging through the flooded fields and canals, acting as armored troop carriers. Small assault boats ferried infantry under intense German fire, often struggling against currents and hidden obstacles. The fighting was characterized by its agonizing slowness and relentless ferocity. Every dike, every ditch, every farm building became a German strongpoint, defended with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The Canadians were forced into a grim, house-to-house, dike-by-dike struggle, often clearing one position only to come under fire from another. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Casualties mounted steadily as the troops navigated the treacherous landscape under constant enemy observation and fire. The misery of the battle was compounded by the atrocious autumn weather. Persistent rain turned the ground into a thick, clinging mud, hampering movement and supply. Low clouds and fog often grounded Allied air support, leaving the infantry exposed. The damp and cold seeped into bones, adding to the exhaustion and demoralization. Despite these hellish conditions, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by their British and Polish comrades, pressed forward with grim determination. Their resilience and courage were unparalleled. After nearly a month of brutal, attritional fighting, by November 3, 1944, the Breskens pocket was finally cleared. The German defenders, having fought with fanatical resolve, were either captured or killed. The cost was immense. Thousands of Allied casualties, a testament to the savagery of the fighting. But the southern bank of the Scheldt Estuary was now in Allied hands, a crucial step towards opening the indispensable port of Antwerp. The next, and perhaps most formidable, obstacle lay across the water: Walcheren Island. While the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was locked in a brutal struggle for the Breskens pocket on the southern bank, the 1st Canadian Army simultaneously launched its offensive on the northern side of the Scheldt Estuary. This critical thrust aimed to clear the South Beveland Peninsula, a long, narrow strip of land leading directly to the strategically vital Walcheren Island. This was a direct, head-on assault across a landscape uniquely designed for defense, forcing the Canadian and British forces into a grinding, attritional battle. The terrain of the South Beveland Peninsula mirrored many of the challenges of the Breskens pocket, but with a different emphasis. It was a flat, low-lying expanse, often below sea level, protected by a complex system of dikes and canals. The Germans, understanding its defensive value, had heavily fortified the area with pillboxes, machine gun nests, and extensive minefields. Crucially, they had prepared to use the water itself as a weapon, deliberately breaching dikes to flood vast areas, creating an impassable barrier for tanks and heavy equipment, forcing infantry to advance along exposed, narrow causeways and dikes. The task of clearing South Beveland fell largely to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Their advance began in mid-October, pushing north from Antwerp towards the neck of the peninsula. What followed was a brutal, linear battle, often fought on constricted fronts where the Germans could concentrate their fire. The Canadians found themselves slogging through knee-deep mud and water, every step a struggle, every dike a potential strongpoint. German defenders, once again, were hardened veterans, ordered to hold their ground at all costs, exploiting every defensive advantage the terrain offered. The fighting was characterized by fierce engagements for individual farmhouses, small villages, and crucial crossroads. German sniper fire was relentless, artillery and mortar barrages were constant, and cunningly placed machine guns swept the exposed dikes. The flooded fields denied any flanking maneuvers, forcing frontal assaults that proved costly. The engineers played a vital, yet perilous, role, constantly attempting to breach German water defenses or construct temporary bridges under fire. One of the most intense phases was the advance on the Beveland Canal, a major water barrier that cut across the peninsula, forming a formidable defensive line. The Germans had concentrated significant forces and firepower along this canal, turning it into a fortress. The Canadian assault on the canal involved bitter fighting, heavy casualties, and a series of determined frontal attacks. Eventually, after days of intense combat, the Canadians, supported by British units, managed to secure crossings and break through the canal line, pushing the German defenders further west towards Walcheren. The miserable autumn weather continued to plague the advance. Persistent rain and fog not only turned the ground into a quagmire but also severely limited Allied air support, allowing German artillery and machine gunners to operate with greater impunity. Exhaustion, trench foot, and exposure became common ailments among the troops, adding to the grim toll of combat. By October 30th, after weeks of grinding combat, the South Beveland Peninsula was largely cleared. The Germans were pushed back to their final, most formidable line of defense, the causeway leading to Walcheren Island. The Canadian-led forces had paid a heavy price in blood and material, but they had successfully achieved their objective. The northern bank of the Scheldt Estuary was now secured, and the stage was set for the final, most audacious phase of the Battle of the Scheldt, the assault on Walcheren Island itself, the heavily fortified linchpin guarding the gateway to Antwerp. This was the final, desperate hurdle that had to be overcome to unlock the indispensable port. At the mouth of the Scheldt Estuary, an insurmountable obstacle seemed to loom: Walcheren Island. This was no mere island, it was a heavily fortified natural bastion, the linchpin of Hitler's entire Scheldt defense, a fortress designed over years to prevent any naval access to Antwerp. The island's strategic location meant that as long as German guns on Walcheren controlled the estuary, no Allied ship could safely reach the indispensable port. Its defenses were so formidable that a direct frontal assault was deemed suicidal. Walcheren was a formidable proposition for several reasons. Impregnable coastal batteries. The island was ringed with powerful German coastal artillery batteries, some with guns capable of firing shells up to 25 miles, covering the entire breadth of the Scheldt Estuary. These were hardened concrete emplacements, designed to withstand heavy naval bombardment and aerial attack. Dense fortifications. Beyond the heavy guns, the island was a maze of bunkers, pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and machine gun nests. Every approach was covered, every potential landing site bristled with defenses. Fanatical garrison. The German garrison, a mix of experienced infantry and naval personnel, was well entrenched and under explicit orders to fight to the last man. Their morale, though dwindling elsewhere, was boosted by the critical importance of their mission. Natural defenses. Much of the island lay below sea level, protected by massive earthen dikes. These dikes, while offering protection from the sea, could also be used as a weapon. A direct assault across the causeway from the South Beveland Peninsula, the only land route, would lead to horrific casualties. The narrow approach would channel attacking forces into a kill zone, exposed to concentrated German fire from all sides. Therefore, the Allied command devised a daring, multi-pronged, and highly unconventional strategy. They would breach the dikes and let the sea itself become their ally, turning Walcheren from a fortress into a flooded, vulnerable island. The plan was audacious. Massive aerial bombing attacks would be used to create controlled breaches in the island's main dikes. The idea was to flood the interior of the island, drowning German defenses, disrupting their communications, and making it impossible for their heavy artillery and transport to maneuver. This would essentially turn the island into a series of isolated pockets of high ground, making amphibious landings from the sea more feasible. This dike-buster strategy, however, was not without controversy. It would inevitably lead to widespread destruction and suffering for the civilian population of Walcheren, a grim calculus of war that weighed heavily on Allied leaders. But the strategic imperative of Antwerp and the projected casualty figures of a purely frontal assault outweighed these concerns. The assault on Walcheren, code-named Operation Infatuate, would involve three distinct prongs, designed to overwhelm the German defenders. Assault across the causeway. Despite the flooding, a limited infantry assault would still be launched across the narrow causeway from South Beveland, primarily by the 1st Battalion, the Glasgow Highlanders of the British 52nd, Lowland, Infantry Division, as a holding action and to draw fire. Amphibious landings. West British commandos, supported by specialized amphibious vehicles, would land at Westkapelle on the western tip of the island, aiming to neutralize the heaviest coastal batteries. Amphibious landings. East. Another force of British commandos would land at Flushing, Vlissingen, on the southeastern tip, pushing inland to secure the town and link up. The role of specialized amphibious vehicles was critical. Buffalo LVTs, landing vehicle tracked, similar to those used in the Breskens pocket, would be employed to traverse the flooded interior, carrying troops and light equipment. Crucially, older warships would be pressed into service for close-range naval bombardment, braving the heavy German coastal guns to suppress defenses during the landings. The assault on Walcheren was recognized as the most dangerous and decisive phase of the entire Scheldt campaign. It required immense coordination, courage, and a willingness to confront a deeply entrenched, fanatical enemy in one of the war's most unique and treacherous battlefields. The fate of Antwerp, and indeed the Allied drive into Germany, rested on the success of Operation Infatuate, to breach the fortress island and finally unlock the indispensable port. With the decision made to breach Walcheren's dikes, the stage was set for Operation Infatuate, the final, audacious assault on the island fortress. This was to be a combined arms operation of unprecedented complexity, relying on massive air power, naval support, and specialized amphibious forces to overcome a fanatical defense in a newly flooded landscape. The morning of November 1, 1944, marked the beginning of a hellish and decisive struggle. The first, devastating blow to Walcheren came from the sky. Starting in early October and intensifying in the days leading up to the invasion, RAF Bomber Command launched a series of massive aerial attacks targeting the island's colossal dikes. 4 key locations were hit: Westkapelle, Veer, Flushing, and the causeway leading to South Beveland. The objective was precise: to create controlled breaches that would allow the sea to flood the low-lying interior of the island. Ton after ton of high explosives ripped through the ancient sea walls, unleashing the North Sea onto Walcheren. The deluge was immense. Within days, vast areas of the island's interior were transformed into a shallow, treacherous sea, with only towns, villages, and some elevated roads remaining as isolated pockets of dry land. This deliberate act of environmental warfare had its intended effect. It drowned German strongpoints, disrupted their communications, rendered their heavy artillery and transport immobile, and turned the entire island into a defensive nightmare. However, it also brought immense suffering to the civilian population and created an incredibly difficult environment for the attacking Allied forces. The amphibious landings began on November 1, 1944, striking from multiple directions. Flushing, Vlissingen, assault, eastern flank British commandos of No. 4 Commando, supported by other infantry units, landed at Flushing, a heavily defended port town on the southeastern tip of Walcheren. This was a grim, house-to-house, street-by-street battle against entrenched German naval infantry and paratroopers. The fighting was ferocious, with every building a potential stronghold. Naval support, including close-range fire from old battleships and destroyers, was crucial in suppressing German resistance as the commandos painstakingly fought their way through the town. Westkapelle assault, western flank. This was arguably the most dangerous and decisive landing. No. 41, Royal Marine, Commando and No. 48, Royal Marine, Commando, supported by specialized vehicles of the 79th Armored Division, landed directly onto the breach at Westkapelle on the island's western tip. The plan was for the commandos to exploit the gap created by the bombing. However, the German coastal batteries at Westkapelle, designed to sink ships, were still largely intact and opened a devastating fire. Buffalo LVTs and Weasels, amphibious landing vehicles like the Buffalo, LVTs, and Weasels, were indispensable. The Buffaloes, designed to traverse water and mud, ferried troops ashore and then pushed inland through the flooded fields, acting as troop carriers and mobile firing platforms. They were the only vehicles capable of navigating the newly created watery landscape. Naval bombardment. To suppress the formidable German coastal batteries, a daring support squadron of older British warships, including HMS Warspite and several monitors, sailed dangerously close to the shore, braving heavy fire to pound the German positions with their big guns. This naval artillery duel was fierce, buying precious time for the commandos. Causeway advance, Eastern Front. Simultaneously, a grim infantry assault was launched across the narrow causeway from the South Beveland Peninsula by the 1st Battalion, the Glasgow Highlanders. This was a brutal frontal attack, with the infantry exposed to concentrated German fire from Walcheren. While a holding action, it drew crucial German attention and tied down defenders. The scene on Walcheren was apocalyptic. The sound of naval guns, aerial bombs, machine guns, and the slosh of amphibious vehicles through the flooded landscape created an unforgettable hellscape. Casualties were high on both sides. The German defenders, though isolated and outmaneuvered by the flooding, fought with fanatical determination, making every advance costly. Yet, the Allied forces, driven by the absolute strategic imperative of opening Antwerp, pushed relentlessly forward. The deluge and the landings were brutal, but they were the necessary, agonizing steps to unlock the indispensable port and break Germany's desperate will. The landings on Walcheren Island marked the beginning of a grim, grinding battle against a determined and fanatical enemy, compounded by the treacherous, flooded terrain. The audacious Allied plan to breach the dikes and flood the island had certainly dislocated the German defenses, but it had not broken their will to fight. What followed was an agonizing, house-to-house, bunker-to-bunker struggle, often fought through knee-deep water and mud, where every gain was measured in yards and paid for in blood. The German defenders, though isolated on pockets of high ground, were well supplied and commanded to resist to the last man. Their coastal batteries, though battered by naval and aerial bombardment, remained a deadly threat. Machine gun nests, mortar teams, and snipers were expertly positioned to sweep the few remaining dry routes and dominate the flooded expanses. The Buffalo amphibious vehicles, invaluable for troop movement, found themselves battling not just the terrain, but also anti-tank fire and desperate infantry assaults. The fighting was particularly brutal in the coastal towns and villages that remained above the floodwaters. Flushing, Vlissingen, after the initial commando landings, became a labyrinth of street fighting. British commandos fought their way through rubble-strewn streets, clearing buildings one by one, facing ambushes and booby traps at every turn. The urban environment negated much of the Allied advantage in heavy weapons, turning the battle into a gritty infantryman's fight. Similarly, at Westkapelle, after the initial amphibious assaults, the commandos had to systematically neutralize the powerful German coastal batteries. These concrete emplacements, designed for long-range naval defense, were now turned against the attacking infantry. It required immense courage and close-quarters fighting, often involving flamethrowers and demolition charges, to root out the fanatical German gun crews. The battle became a grim procession of reducing strongpoint after strongpoint, with heavy casualties for the attacking forces. The advance inland through the flooded interior was equally harrowing. Buffalo LVTs ferried troops between isolated patches of dry land, but dismounted infantry often had to wade through cold, brackish water, laden with equipment, facing unseen enemy fire from distant strongpoints. The misery was compounded by the relentless autumn weather, cold, damp, and often foggy, leading to widespread cases of trench foot, exhaustion, and illness among the troops. Medical evacuation was a constant challenge, with casualties often having to be transported through the treacherous waters. Despite the appalling conditions and the fanatical German resistance, the Allied forces, a combined effort of British commandos, specialized amphibious units, and elements of the Canadian Army, pressed forward with unwavering determination. Their objective was clear: Walcheren had to be cleared to open Antwerp. Slowly, painfully, they reduced the remaining German strongpoints. Key areas of high ground were captured, allowing Allied artillery to be brought onto the island, providing vital fire support. By November 8, 1944, after a week of relentless and brutal combat, the last major German resistance on Walcheren Island crumbled. The remaining German commander and his forces, isolated, exhausted, and running low on ammunition, finally surrendered. The cost was immense: thousands of Allied casualties, a testament to the savagery of the fighting. But the ultimate prize had been secured. The powerful coastal batteries were silenced, the heavily defended shorelines were in Allied hands, and the German grip on the Scheldt Estuary was finally broken. The clearing of Walcheren was a critical, hard-won victory that paved the way for the decisive opening of Antwerp. It was a testament to the extraordinary courage and resilience of the Allied troops who fought through one of the most unique and hellish battlefields of the war. With Walcheren secured, the 65-mile-long Scheldt Estuary could finally be cleared of mines, and the indispensable port of Antwerp could at last fulfill its destiny as the logistical lifeline for the final push into Germany. The hell of the Scheldt was finally over. The clearing of Walcheren Island on November 8, 1944, marked the end of the brutal, month-long battle of the Scheldt. The suffering endured by Canadian, British, and Polish forces in the muddy, flooded hellscape of the estuary had been immense, but the strategic prize they secured was equally monumental. With the last German guns on Walcheren silenced, the long, treacherous Scheldt Estuary could finally be cleared of mines, and the indispensable port of Antwerp could, at last, fulfill its destiny as the ultimate logistical lifeline for the final push into Germany. The immediate task after the fighting ceased was the perilous work of mine sweeping. The Germans had thoroughly seeded the 65-mile-long estuary with thousands of naval mines, knowing they were the last barrier to Antwerp. Royal Navy mine-sweeping flotillas, working under immense pressure and constant danger, began the painstaking process of clearing the waterway. It took another 3 weeks of dedicated, dangerous work, but by November 28, 1944, the first Allied convoy, led by the Canadian-built merchant ship Fort Cataraqui, sailed triumphantly into the port of Antwerp. The opening of Antwerp was an immediate and profound game-changer for the Allied war effort. It instantly transformed the logistical landscape of the Western Front. No longer were millions of tons of supplies dependent on the strained Red Ball Express from Normandy or the limited capacity of the Mulberry Bee harbor. Antwerp, with its vast, undamaged docks and extensive rail and road connections, could handle an unprecedented volume of cargo. Massive throughput. By early 1945, Antwerp was handling an astonishing average of 25,000 to 40,000 tons of supplies daily. This far exceeded the combined capacity of all other available ports. Strategic relief. It drastically shortened the Allied supply lines, freeing up thousands of trucks and drivers from the arduous Red Ball Express routes for other critical duties. It also reduced the immense pressure on the shattered French infrastructure. Fueling the final push, the port became a primary receiving point for fuel, which was then distributed inland, complementing the Pluto pipelines and ensuring the insatiable demands of the mechanized armies could be met. For Hitler and his high command, the opening of Antwerp was a devastating psychological and strategic blow. Their last best hope for crippling the Allied advance through logistical starvation had utterly failed. They had invested immense resources and endured fanatical resistance to deny the Allies this port, believing it would be their salvation. Instead, the Allies had broken through, paying a terrible price, but securing the very lifeline that would seal Germany's fate. Their bewilderment over Allied logistical ingenuity, which had begun with Mulberry and Pluto, was now complete. Hitler's desperate response was the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, launched in mid-December 1944. A primary objective of this massive counterattack was the recapture of Antwerp, or at least its severance from the Allied supply chain. This desperate gamble, fueled by the knowledge of Antwerp's vital importance, ultimately failed, but it underscored just how critical the port was to both sides. The Battle of the Scheldt, though often overshadowed by more famous campaigns, was strategically indispensable. It was a brutal, grinding, and costly victory, paid for with the lives and suffering of thousands of Canadian, British, and Polish soldiers. It demonstrated the unwavering determination of the Allied forces to achieve their objectives, no matter the cost or the misery of the battlefield. The enduring legacy of the Scheldt is a testament to the quiet heroism of those who fought in one of the war's most miserable and strategically vital campaigns. It reminds us that victory is rarely won by a single glorious strike, but often by the grinding, arduous, and unyielding fight for critical objectives like a port. The Hell of the Scheldt was a crucible of courage, a testament to Allied resolve, and the bloody, indispensable fight for the ultimate lifeline. By opening Antwerp, the Allies ensured that the momentum gained on D-Day would carry all the way to Berlin, breaking Germany's will and sealing the Third Reich's ultimate defeat.